It's Katrina. The Pikatrix. The Pikatrix is an ancient magic and astrology book, 400 pages, originally written in Arabic back in the middle of the 11th century. The title of the book translates roughly into English as The Aim of the Sage. But after it was translated from Arabic into Spanish, and then eventually from Spanish into Latin, it simply became known as the Pikatrix. There are a lot of ancient books of magic out there, many of which contain secret and forbidden knowledge that's being lost to time. But this one is different in that it's considered to be the handbook of talismanic magic. The Pikatrix is one of the most in-depth books on astrological magic, celestial magic, and alchemy that was ever written. All the information in the book was taken from other sources, from multiple magical texts written between the 9th and 10th centuries. The author of the Pikatrix put all of these different learnings together into one volume. The book discusses alchemical processes, philosophical doctrines, directions on how to practice art, and how to understand the cosmos. Magic is described as theoretical and physical, but it pretty much all relies on the stars. The book goes into great detail about how to make talismans and then use them with the proper constellations to improve your fortune. It also explains how to be more in harmony with the magical forces of nature to live a better life. Ancient flying machine of the Bible. In the Bible, Ezekiel is a key figure. He's described as a prophet, and it's he who wrote the book of Ezekiel from a first-person perspective. This is quite unlike a lot of other books in the Bible that are written in the third person. In the Bible, Ezekiel describes witnessing a wheeled chariot descending from the sky. The chariot is piloted by creatures that look like humans, but are not. And while many biblical scholars will say Ezekiel simply saw God riding the chariot, other historians aren't quite as convinced. Some say what Ezekiel wrote had nothing to do with the Christian God, but actually a race of aliens. They say this wasn't a chariot, it was a mothership piloted by extraterrestrials. The only reason Ezekiel called the craft a chariot was because he had nothing else to compare it with. He didn't know what he was seeing was an advanced species of space beings who came down to him from the sky. It was in the 1970s that Erich von Däniken started talking about this controversial idea. He even wrote a book called Chariots of the Gods, in which he describes how Ezekiel had a vision of a space shuttle and not a divine cart driven by God. One of Erich's main points is the description of the wheeled chariot itself. It sounds almost like a landing spacecraft. In the Bible, Ezekiel describes a windstorm, flashes of lightning, and brilliant lights exploding from around the chariot, all while dirt is being kicked up and fire roars from around the base of the chariot, causing it to glow like shining metal. Engineering marvel in Petra. Deep in the desert in the Middle East, in the country of Jordan, there lies the great ancient city of Petra. It's surrounded by desert canyons, steep mountains, and barren terrain. But once, Petra was a bustling hub of activity. With politics, trade, and unique culture, Petra was like the New York City of the Middle Eastern desert for centuries. The area itself had been inhabited since around 7000 BC, although it wasn't until the 4th century BC that the Nabateans came along and Petra reached its full potential. One of the most amazing things about Petra is how it thrived in a region with very little water. The Nabateans came up with a storage and irrigation system for their small supply of water that would rival even the most modern engineering projects. And this has stumped historians. Petra is in a hostile location, carved inside of a canyon in a desert landscape where temperatures reach over 107 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet they created cisterns, dams, and channels to help harness water from desert springs and the meager 4 inches of rainfall they got every year. Using this impressive technology, the Nabateans thrived. All 30,000 people living in Petra flourished, although they basically had little water, all because of this brilliant technology. And then the Romans came along in 106 and wiped them out. But what's really shocking is that even after the dust had settled, the Romans were gone, and the region was once more inhabited by nomadic shepherds. Nobody ever went back to live in the city. They just gave up, and the knowledge of their ancestors was lost. Nobody had any idea how to get water out of the desert, and so the place remained abandoned for centuries. Archaeologists are in awe of an intricate irrigation system found in the ancient city of Petra, which one expert said would be hard to duplicate in the 21st century. The system was so efficient that there was even enough water for a 140-foot public swimming pool in the royal gardens of the city. One researcher described it as an unparalleled luxury in the middle of a desert. The Levosaur Cryptogram. Olivier Levosaur was a pirate who went by the nickname La Bouse, or the Buzzard. He was notorious in the 18th century for being a ruthless pirate who attacked his enemies with bloodthirsty fury, but he's also famous today for allegedly hiding one of the biggest treasures in history, something estimated to be worth over $1 billion. In the year 1724, Olivier Levasseur desperately wanted to escape the French government. The government was giving amnesty to pirates for the return of stolen property, but Olivier was a dedicated pirate and didn't want to give up his loot. He went into hiding in the Seychelles archipelago, was captured a few years later, and then was hanged for piracy on July 7, 1730. According to legend, when he was hanged, he had a necklace around his neck that contained inside of it a mysterious cryptogram. The cryptogram was supposedly the map to his hidden treasure, the biggest undiscovered treasure in pirate history. But to this day, nobody has been able to decipher the document. It's 17 lines of text, each one totally indecipherable. Not even the greatest codebreakers in the world have ever been able to figure it out. However, one man has claimed to have a place to start, writing, "Using this alphabet, I expect you to decipher the cryptogram and find the treasure yourself, where I have hidden your next clue. I expect it will take many months of effort on your part and no small expense at traveling. You'll have to get to the Seychelles archipelago by either submarine or seaplane, but I promise it will be worth it. I'm sure you can fit this challenge into your schedule and budget." What would you do if you found the treasure? Egyptian solar power. A team of researchers has discovered an ancient form of Egyptian solar power. A very primitive form of solar power, but still, it's power. The Egyptians were able to use obsidian, which is volcanic glass, with boron, to create simplistic solar cells with hand-drawn copper wiring. These cells could be used for electroplating, which was used to produce metallic coatings to cover statues or jewelry in gold and silver. Basically, a small electric charge was used in a solution to produce the desired metallic coating. It was how ancient people practiced such sophisticated gilding, and how they made cheap nickel statues look like they were made of solid gold. If this entire process sounds complicated, that's because it is. It's amazing to think that 4,500 years ago, the Old Kingdom in Egypt had figured out how to make electric solar cells to help with metal coating. Proof came recently when Professor Anna Kumar and her team uncovered pieces of obsidian stone at a dig site near the Great Pyramids. These pieces of obsidian had been inlaid with copper in the past, looking like solar panels full of circuits. When the researchers tested the ancient pieces of obsidian, placing them in the sunlight, they generated a tiny yet measurable current. Kumar noted that it's the flaws in a solar panel that yield most of the light, and since a piece of obsidian is a defective material for solar cells by today's standards, it's better at producing light in this way than modern panels. While the amount of light given off is dim and almost impossible to see during the day, in a dark room it would have been remarkable to people whose only other imitation lighting would have come from candles and oil lanterns. Helicopter hieroglyphs. There is an ancient mural in the Temple of Seti I in Abydos which features something highly unusual. On the wall of the temple is a broad horizontal band of sculpted decorations, or Egyptian frieze, covered in hieroglyphs. And while most of the hieroglyphics look pretty standard by ancient Egyptian standards, one of them sticks out like a sore thumb. The engraving on the wall appears to be a helicopter. And that's not all. There are also hieroglyphs of what look to be airplanes and submarines. The suggestion is that ancient Egyptians were visited by a time traveler, extraterrestrial entities, or had somehow gotten a glimpse of future war machines of the 20th century. Archaeologists deny this, and they say it's just pareidolia. That's the human tendency to perceive a pattern or a meaning in something when there isn't one, like a face on the moon or a dragon in a cloud. The material used to cover the Seti I inscription eroded over time, which led to the appearance of a single collective image. Conspiracy theorists have used modern digital equipment to alter the photographs of the carving, to remove details, and make it look more like current technology in order to support their pseudo-scientific narratives. But whatever the case, there is no denying that at this mysterious Egyptian temple, someone stamped images that look like submarines and helicopters into the lines of hieroglyphs. Lost magic of the Norse. The When the Vikings eventually faded away, so too did their ancient magic. The Norse practiced a type of magic called satyr for centuries, primarily in the late Scandinavian Iron Age. But by the 11th century in Denmark and Norway, and the 12th century in Sweden, the magic of satyr was gone, and Christianity was the dominant religion. But the origins of the Old Norse magic have remained alive in folklore and legend. We know that the practitioners of satyr may have been part of a cult, a group of shamans who went on visionary journeys, most likely drug-induced, and then dealt out their cosmic knowledge to anyone who would listen. We also know that for the Old Norse, their magic was quite naturalistic. All of their magical spells, sacred dances, and rituals had to do with healing and nature. Shamans were considered to be the intermediaries between the realm of the spirits and the physical world where people lived. Practicing satyr didn't mean casting spells and hexes. It was all about performing ceremonies at natural places which were filled with earthly power. Springs, waterfalls, volcanoes, large rocks, or anywhere of great natural beauty. With the rise of Christianity, this kind of naturalistic magic was abolished, and there were no more waterfall rituals. The Odyssey and The Iliad. If you're into archaeology and ancient history, you've probably heard of Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, and you've probably heard of the Iliad as well. These are two of the most influential pieces of literature in human history, detailing the Trojan War, the pantheon of Greek gods, and all kinds of terrifying monsters. And while the stories may all seem like myth and legend, recent evidence says they may have been a lot more authentic than previously believed. There is no proof that the gods of Mount Olympus ever existed, or that horrifying creatures called sirens lured sailors to their deaths. However, all these things could very well have been based on reality, or at least genuine things that happened and got vastly embellished. Researchers in Greece recently found the palace of Odysseus, who was the legendary king of Ithaca and the hero in Homer's poem. Archaeologists are now saying the 8th century palace just excavated in Ithaca, in the Ionian Seas just off the Greek mainland, proves Odysseus was a real historical figure. That means that Homer's books were possibly inspired by actual events, and the characters in the books could have been genuine people. The ever-burning lamps. You've probably heard of ever-burning lamps before, ordinary lamps that burn with no oil. The most famous example is the story of Hanukkah, which commemorates the miracle of the menorah burning for 8 days when it only had enough oil to burn for one. This was important to the Jewish people because they had just reclaimed the Holy Temple in Jerusalem and had to rededicate the temple by lighting the menorah. There are stories about ever-burning lamps all over the world. In North America, Great Britain, Greece, and even Asia. In the year 140 AD, when the tomb of Pallas in Italy was opened, there was supposedly a single lamp still burning near the corpse. And during the reign of Emperor Justinian, a legion of Roman soldiers stumbled upon a lamp that had been lit 550 years before and was still going strong. And in the tomb of Constantius Chlorus, who died in the year 300 AD, a lamp was found burning when King Henry VII ordered the tomb opened over 1,000 years later. The stories go on and on. We don't know why these random, seemingly inexplicable lamps keep turning up in mysterious tombs. We don't know how they could possibly burn without fuel. And to be honest, we don't even know if the stories are real. It appears to be a recurring theme in history. A single magical lamp that never goes out. The Knowledge of Alexandria. The Great Library of Alexandria was once the most significant repository of knowledge in the ancient world. Sadly, it's been gone for nearly 2,000 years. Back in the 2nd century BC, the creation of the Great Library of Alexandria was basically like the creation of the internet. It was originally commissioned by Ptolemy I, then was the center of learning and knowledge for 300 years. People from all over the world would come to the library to read from its thousands of books, gain wisdom, and congregate. The administrators of the library were trying to hold all written knowledge in existence inside the library's walls. It had at least 700,000 books, according to ancient history scholar Garrett Ryan. That's a phenomenal number of books, especially considering the library was active back in 200 BC. Unfortunately, one of the greatest libraries mankind has ever known was burned down by Julius Caesar in the year 48 BC. All the knowledge and the historical records of what had happened throughout civilization's early years was all destroyed. Some have even suggested that the destruction of the Library of Alexandria sent civilization back hundreds and hundreds of years. Scientific topics that were being studied in Alexandria weren't studied again for years to come, basically stagnating humanity's growth. Exorcism Manual. Robert Harley was an English nobleman who acquired a collection of more than 600 manuscripts by 1753. After he died, his son sold them to the British Museum, where experts have been working for over 2 centuries to decipher and translate the texts. Written in multiple European languages, the writings cover a wide array of topics, including alchemy, medicine, religion, and more. One manuscript, catalogued simply as Harley MS 2874, was never decoded because it simply made no sense. The words appear to be made up of letters that are randomly jumbled together, and experts couldn't get any intelligible message from it. It was considered an unsolvable mystery. But in 2019, staff at the British Museum solved the mystery. They took another look at the manuscript and were able to decipher it after realizing that the encryption system that the writer used is simpler and more straightforward than they originally thought. They soon realized that the strange book is an exorcism manual, and it's a copy of the original, which is in the secret vault of the Vatican. As it turns out, it's not so secret after all. While the handwritten manuscript is written in code, 30 unencrypted copies were printed during the 15th and 16th centuries. Researchers believe that a monk likely created the handwritten copy, and that he probably encrypted the text so that bad people can't use the exorcism techniques for evil purposes, which was a genuine fear among the devout at that time. Bohemian Grove. Set back in a remote redwood forest in Monte Rio, California, is a 2,700-acre campground called Bohemian Grove. For 2 weeks every July, wealthy and powerful politicians, businessmen, and other elites gather there to socialize, drink, and engage in other activities away from the prying eyes of the public. The tradition started in 1872, when a group of San Francisco-based intellectuals and artists started gathering in the woods to bond over their shared interests. The male-only group's dynamics changed when they decided to open membership up to men with a lot of money and influence. It didn't take long before these well-off recruits took over the club's leadership and ousted its more bohemian or hippie members. Past members include Nelson Rockefeller, Richard Nixon, Walter Cronkite, Theodore Roosevelt, Colin Powell, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, just to name a few. Nobody knows exactly what goes on at the Bohemian Grove gathering. Only men are allowed to attend, and it's said that the event's motto discourages work of any kind while it's going on. In other words, it sounds like a place for members of America's upper crust to let loose, without having to worry about media scrutiny or any other problems that might happen if they partied in plain view. It reportedly costs $25,000 just to join the Bohemian Grove, and members are required to pay annual dues. There are an estimated 2,500 members, and the only way to get in is to be recommended by someone who's already in the club. A former member who spoke with All That's Interesting said that the waiting list to get in is between 20 and 30 years. Based on what he told the website, it sounds like nothing too scandalous goes on at the gathering besides some seriously heavy drinking. Then again, he could just be saying that to cover up the truth. The true Tiananmen death count. During the 1980s, the Communist Chinese government began to allow some private and foreign investments in hopes of improving the country's economy and raising its standard of living. But with the changes came corruption, and at the same time, a lot of young people hoped that the new policies symbolized progress toward more political openness. Students began protesting for more freedom and less censorship. When a progressive politician who helped push the recent changes through was found dead in 1989, these demonstrations grew. Angry activists gathered at Tiananmen Square in Beijing, with crowds peaking at an estimated 1 million. Authorities hesitated to take action at first, but some officials pushed for a hardline response and got their wish. Martial law was declared in May of that year as the Chinese army began advancing toward the square. Troops resorted to violence to regain control of the area, opening fire on protesters, crushing people, and doing whatever else they felt was necessary to carry out their orders. In one famous photo, a young man can be seen facing off with an entire line of military tanks before being dragged away by two men. After shutting down the demonstration with brute force, Chinese officials claimed that an estimated 200 to 300 people were killed, including several dozen security personnel. Others have reported fatalities numbering in the thousands, and to this day, nobody knows for sure exactly how many people died. In 2017, newly declassified British documents revealed that a diplomatic cable put the Tiananmen Square massacre death toll at around 10,000. British Ambassador Sir Alan Donald sent the message a little over a day after the tragedy, citing a friend of a Chinese government insider as his source. He went on to clarify that the person had proven to be a reliable source in the past, and that he was mindful to differentiate facts from speculation and rumor. The disturbing note describes how protesters were given 5 minutes to leave the square and had not yet cleared out when the military began mowing people down and repeatedly running over their bodies, which were reportedly later collected using a bulldozer. Some people begged for their lives, only to be mercilessly slaughtered on the spot. The Chinese government actively removes internet posts about the massacre, discourages discussion about it, and has taken down one of the only memorials to the victims in Hong Kong. Sadly, many, if not most, members of the younger generation are kept largely in the dark about the injustices that occurred that day, and it's clear that the country's leaders don't want the rest of the world to know the details either. Deadly syphilis study. In 1932, researchers from the U.S. Public Health Service and the Tuskegee Institute set out to study the natural course that syphilis will take in humans if left untreated. But in order to do that, they needed people to die from it so they could perform autopsies. They recruited 600 African American men, including 399 who had the disease and 201 who did not, in what the recruits thought was a program to treat bad blood, as it was called back then. They received free medical exams, meals, and burial insurance in exchange for their participation. But most of the men with syphilis never received proper treatment for the disease, even after penicillin became widely available in 1943 and could have easily cured them. In the meantime, the personnel running the study had the participants under the impression that they were receiving adequate care. As a result, at least 28 of the men died from syphilis, while dozens of others died from complications related to the disease. Of course, the public was largely unaware of the experiment. The disturbing study was only meant to last for 6 months, but it continued for 40 years. Finally, in 1972, an Associated Press journalist blew the whistle on the case with a damning article that provoked widespread public outrage. The program ended 3 months later, and survivors were given lifelong health care, but by then, a lot of the damage was already done. Participants sued the government and settled out of court for $10 million. Lawmakers implemented new legislation requiring informed consent for participation in studies and other policies meant to prevent something like this from ever happening again. It wasn't until 1997 that a formal apology was given to the victims on behalf of the government by President Bill Clinton. Government-sanctioned assassination plots. When Fidel Castro rose to power and began implementing socialism in Cuba with financial backing from the Soviet Union, U.S. intelligence officials began to increasingly see him as a thorn in their side that it would simply be easier to do away with. The CIA entertained numerous potential ways of carrying out the assassination, including, at one point, planting an explosive seashell in his favorite diving area, which would be activated by touch. None of the plans ever panned out, but it wasn't for a lack of trying. On one occasion, the agency tried to somehow get Castro to smoke an explosive cigar laced with a deadly toxin. They lost track of the cigars while they were supposedly en route to their destination, and nobody knows what became of the intended murder weapon. Agents also considered involving mafia hitmen, compromising the dictator's scuba diving gear, and having an attractive woman set him up to get him killed. Altogether, at least 364 attempts were made on Castro's life, with some experts putting the number as high as 600. Not all of them were carried out on behalf of the US, but enough people wanted the revolutionary leader dead for him to pretty much be a constant target. In recent years, paperwork detailing the CIA's desire to permanently remove Castro from power has been declassified. revealing the sinister, bizarre, and arguably reckless murder plans that until then, U.S. citizens had no knowledge of. Fake Titanic search. For years following the 1985 discovery of the RMS Titanic, people thought that it simply meant a successful mission for Robert Ballard, the U.S. Navy commander and Woods Hole scientist who found the wreck. But the military had funded Ballard's search for the Titanic under the condition that he first participate in a mission to recover 2 American nuclear submarines from the ocean floor. Shortly after the true nature of the operation was declassified in 2018, he told CNN that he was tasked with locating the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion, which sank during the 1960s, while using the Titanic expedition as a convenient cover story. U.S. authorities didn't want the Russians to track Ballard's movements as he sought to investigate the nuclear weapons that went down with the Scorpion and observe their effects on the environment. After carrying out his assigned duties, he had just 12 days to locate the Titanic within the vast, deep northern Atlantic. Days after news broke of the discovery, some news outlets had gotten wind of possible secret military involvement and perhaps ulterior motives for facilitating Ballard's exploration. Officials were quick to squash these suspicions, only to admit years later that there really was more to the story. Literary warfare. As the US and Soviet Union came increasingly close to blows during the Cold War, while avoiding physical warfare at all costs, the two countries came up with some creative ways to one-up each other without using direct violence. In 2014, newly declassified documents revealed that the CIA printed Russian-language copies of the Boris Pasternak novel Dr. Zhivago and distributed them to civilians throughout the Soviet Union. The meddling began in the late 1950s. At the time, the book was banned throughout the USSR because it was seen as containing anti-revolutionary sentiments, and the CIA saw it as the perfect way to plant doubt in the minds of Soviet citizens and to make them question their own government, according to the declassified materials. They believed that people would really appreciate the book and that it would instill them with reminders that people deserve freedom and privacy from the state. Confident that the story would counter the Soviet philosophy of excessive self-sacrifice for the greater good, agents passed copies out to Russian tourists at the 1958 Brussels Universal and International Exposition. As part of their training, CIA officers were instructed on how to strike up conversations about literature with any Soviet visitors or officials they might encounter in the West. They were encouraged to discuss topics like communism versus freedom of expression, as well as the plight of individuals who are forced to live in communist societies, according to a 1959 memo. While it has long been known that the U.S. government handed out thousands of books as a sort of cultural warfare tactic during the Cold War, it wasn't until recent years that the CIA documents about it were declassified. British historian and journalist Frances Stoner Saunders, who has written extensively about the Cold War, told The Guardian that the agency's timing for releasing the documents made her suspicious. She explained that the timing was potentially beneficial for American foreign policy and added that the CIA only releases information when it benefits them in some way. And based on their history, it's hard to disagree. Project Azorian. In 1968, a Soviet submarine known as K-129 sank roughly 1,600 miles northwest of Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean. 4 years later, the CIA embarked on a top-secret mission to recover the submerged vessel from the ocean floor. Codenamed Project Azorian, it was one of the most expensive and complicated Cold War operations undertaken by the U.S. government. The Soviets didn't know where the wreck was located, but American surveillance equipment had detected the explosion that happened the day the submarine sank, so authorities knew exactly where to look. They recovered part of the ship, but 2/3 of it broke off and descended back to the sea during the recovery. In a proposal set forth by Defense Secretary Melvin Laird and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, the operation's purpose was to obtain a nuclear missile on board the vessel, as well as cryptographic materials. The project received widespread media attention, but the CIA strived to keep almost all the details of it confidential, including the specifics about what they recovered during the mission and how successful it was. Some people, including a respected Time magazine journalist, suspected that Project Azorian itself was meant to function as a cover-up for another secret mission and to keep people distracted from something else going on. These allegations have never been proven, but it's hard not to wonder when the publicly disclosed details surrounding the operation remain murky to this day. Maya bloodletting. The ancient Maya participated in horrifying bloodletting rituals. These disturbing ceremonies involved siphoning blood out of a person to allow direct communication with the gods. The Maya called their bloodletting rituals cha'ab, and they were specifically for the nobles and royalty. It was a way for the top members of society to communicate with their own royal ancestors and to speak with their mysterious deities. Bloodletting was done by perforating a specific body part and allowing the blood to run out. This could be anything from cutting open one's tongue to slicing their private parts. The ritual could be performed by men or women, so long as they had pure enough blood and were high up on the social ladder. However, it wasn't enough to just bleed themselves dry. The Maya needed to enter an altered state of consciousness in order to talk to the spirits and the gods. Before they started bleeding, they would usually fast for several days, smoke a lot of tobacco, and then take a ritual enema. The enema most likely contained hallucinogenic drugs. By the time they finally got around to the bloodletting, they were already extremely intoxicated. Once the bleeding began, the person participating would have visions and be able to communicate with their gods or ancestors. Typically, they would ask for things like rain, for success during the next battle, or to satiate whatever other needs and desires they may have had. Land diving. Land diving is an ancient ritual that's still performed today by the men living in Vanuatu on the Pentecost Island. The ritual involves men jumping off a tower nearly 100 feet tall with nothing but a pair of tree vines wrapped around their legs. It's basically bungee jumping, but far more dangerous, and has a much older history. The tradition of land diving goes back to an unknown time, but it definitely dates back to many centuries ago. The indigenous Pentecost Islanders would build towering platforms of wood, climb to the top, and then bungee jump using tree vines. If the dive went well, it symbolized a bountiful yam harvest to come. However, the ritual was about more than just juicy yams. The dive was, and still is, believed to enhance health, make the diver stronger, and heal the sick. It's also a symbol of masculinity, because only the boldest and bravest warriors participate. Those who refuse to dive are considered cowards and are often driven out of their tribe. According to the Guinness World Records, the G-force experienced by the land divers was the greatest experienced by any human prior to the industrialized world. These days, land diving has become a tourist attraction. It's still a practiced ritual, but now people travel from all over the world to see it done in person. Even Queen Elizabeth II went to watch the spectacle herself in 1974, but sadly, the jumper she witnessed hit the ground, broke his back, and died. The psychedelic Ellucinian mysteries. All throughout the ancient world, psychedelic drugs were used in strange and mysterious rituals. This was just as true in ancient Greece as it was for the Inca Empire on the other side of the globe. The Greeks preferred to use psychedelic drugs as part of their Eleusinian mysteries. The Eleusinian mysteries honored the goddess Demeter and her daughter, the wife of Hades, Persephone. These celebrations were considered the most sacred of all the ancient Greek religious festivals. The mysteries took place annually from at least 1600 BC until 392 AD. The festival was such a big deal that as soon as one ended, preparations for the next one began. However, the rituals were also very secretive. We know little about them today because the Greeks never allowed anyone to write down the specific details. One of the things archaeologists have learned from excavations is that the participants in the ritual ceremonies drank something called kykeon. This was a highly hallucinogenic liquid that was consumed after days of self-starvation. Once the participants were seeing sounds and tasting colors, nobody is really sure what they did. There was most likely dancing and some reenacting of Greek myths, but since writing about the Eleusinian mysteries was punishable by death, this is about as much as we know. Stopping Ragnarok. In Iceland, there is a dark and creepy cavern which may have been the site of ceremonial activity 1,000 years ago. Inside the cave, Viking elites may have participated in rituals to try and avert the apocalypse, known in Viking lore as Ragnarok. The cavern is about 980 feet beneath the entrance to a cave. Way down in the dark, archaeologists came across a structure built of rock and shaped like a boat. The team of researchers also found beads, decorative materials, and burned animal bones. The structure was made in the late part of the 9th century AD, after the first Vikings settled in Iceland. The cave itself was formed by a volcanic eruption that occurred soon after the Vikings arrived. Historians think the volcanic activity was so biblically terrifying to the Vikings that they saw it as a sign of the end of days. They believed Ragnarok was coming and that it would bring about the end of all things. So they tried to stop it. Archaeological evidence suggests they went down into the newly formed cavern, built themselves an altar, and sacrificed animals to try and appease the gods. The Vikings were so worried the world would end that they pulled out all the stops. They sacrificed goats, sheep, and every other piece of livestock they could find in order to try and prevent the incoming apocalypse. And apparently, it worked. Dancing for Sekhmet. Dancing was a major part of life in ancient Egypt. We know this because of paintings and inscriptions left on the walls of tombs and temples throughout the country. Countless statues, effigies, and figurines show Egyptian people in positions of dance, and they were doing this as far back as the New Kingdom, around 1570 BC. Most historians agree that dancing started as rituals to mourn the dead and to appease the goddess Sekhmet. In Egyptian mythology, Sekhmet almost destroyed all of humanity when Ra, god of the sun, asked her to punish all who had forgotten him. She was believed to be the goddess of war, disease, and destruction, and the Egyptians danced to appease her violent wrath. As the years went on, dancing became more and more important in ritual activity. Unfortunately, we don't know what any of their dances looked like. All we have are still images on the walls of tombs, single snapshots of what was almost certainly a highly complex dance routine. We know dancers followed funeral processions and that the people mostly danced in groups. However, based on ancient paintings, men and women were not allowed to dance together. It was either groups of men or groups of women dancing, usually accompanied by music, and most of the time they were naked, except for a loincloth. Aztec human sacrifice. Of all the horrendous rituals that took place in the ancient world, those of the Aztec were perhaps the most gruesome. When the Spanish arrived in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1521, brutal blood rituals conducted by Aztec priests were documented. These priests used sharp knives of obsidian to slice open the chests of their victims while they were still breathing. They then offered the beating heart of the victim to their gods before kicking the lifeless body down the steps of the great Templo Mayor. This was for a very long time believed to be nothing but propaganda. Modern historians figured the Spanish had made up the stories about sacrifices to paint the Aztec people in a poor light. This belief made the destruction, thievery, and enslavement committed by the Spanish more tolerable for their people. However, in 2015 and 2018, archaeologists found proof of the bloody rituals. They uncovered skull towers in Mexico City that confirmed the events described by the conquistadors. These towers were constructed on either side of the Templo Mayor and were used to show off the skulls of their many victims. It now looks like the Aztec really did commit mass amounts of human sacrifice. Expert John Verano from Tulane University says that these rituals were done for the greater good. For the Aztec, they were sacrificing people to save the world, and it all had to do with their belief system. In Aztec mythology, the sun god Huitzilopochtli waged a constant war against the dark. The only way to keep him moving across the sky, fighting off the eternal darkness and preserving their lives, was to feed him human hearts. Supernatural water rituals. Archaeologists came across a mysterious wooden structure from the Bronze Age that was built in Italy over 3,000 years ago. It was likely used for mysterious water rituals involving the supernatural. Researchers believe the structure may have been a pool, and that it was positioned in such a way that it would reflect the sky and the burning sun. The way the water would have shimmered may have given those involved in the ritual the impression that they were looking into another dimension. Symbolically, this Bronze Age pool could have been used to lead people into a different realm. The exact time of construction was most likely around 1436 BC, when much of Italy was undergoing a religious revolution. The pool was found near the small town of Noceto in 2004 by Italian archaeologists. It was the primitive version of an infinity pool, about 40 feet long and 23 feet wide, with a depth of 10 feet. However, this pool wasn't found inside of any kind of structure, and was built at the top of a hill and lined by wooden poles and beams. Sadly, nobody's sure what ritual took place here. All they can say for certain is that it had something to do with a mirror realm. The pool worked as an illusion, giving the participants the feeling that they were transcending the earthly plane and experiencing some kind of alternate dimension. Mass child sacrifice. 500 years ago in Peru, the single most horrific ritual in history took place. According to National Geographic, evidence for the largest incident of child sacrifice in the Americas, and possibly the world, was found on the north coast of Peru. This sacrifice took place more than 500 years ago, with over 140 children being ritually murdered in a single event. It happened on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, just outside the capital city of the Chimu Empire. There were a lot of civilizations that practiced human sacrifice, especially in early Mesoamerica. However, most sacrifices were small, 1 or 2 people to appease the gods. In the case of the Aztec, they sometimes sacrificed a lot of victims at one time, but these were usually grown men and hardened warriors. The sacrifice that took place near the town of Huanchaco was unlike anything else in the ancient world. It happened less than a mile from the city of Chan Chan, where the Chimu ruled over 600 miles of the Pacific coast from the border of Ecuador to Lima. The Chimu made up the largest empire in South America until they were defeated by the Inca in 1475. The sacrifice took place between 1400 and 1450, which has led scientists to speculate that the ritual could have had something to do with their impending doom. Whatever happened, there is no evidence anywhere else in the world of this large of a sacrifice. It's pretty horrific, and even included the murder of about 200 young llamas. Magical crystals. In England, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of fragments of rare quartz crystal. These fragments were excavated from a Neolithic ceremonial site, a place where early humans in Britain performed strange and mystical rituals. The crystal came from about 80 miles away, and it had been shattered into small pieces. Researchers believe the tiny fragments would have been presented to the locals as a kind of magical material. Nick Overton, an archaeologist from the University of Manchester, says the crystal is over 6,000 years old. This was a time when there was no glass and no transparent material that ordinary people would have seen. This fact would have made the crystal, a material considered triboluminescent, something rare and exciting. People would have been mesmerized when they witnessed how the crystals refracted light and gave off flashes of blue. We don't know exactly what kind of rituals happened here, but the crystal was found on Dorstone Hill, which was part of a ceremonial landscape 1,000 years before Stonehenge. There would have been large stone structures, ceremonial altars, and primitive timber buildings. It was a huge complex dedicated to unknown ceremonies, and the crystal almost certainly played an important part. The fiery death. 20,000 years ago, a woman was burned to a crisp in a fiery death ritual. Her burnt remains were discovered in modern times in an ancient hunter's camp in Jordan. She most likely belonged to a primitive group of Neolithic humans living in the Middle East. The hunter's camp was a seasonal pit stop, little more than a group of huts that the nomadic tribe would have lived in. It's important to note the woman wasn't burned alive. At least researchers don't think she was. Instead, she was brought into a small hut after her death and set on fire. After she started to burn, she was turned on her side and her knees were bent against her chest. After that, those performing the ritual exited the hut and stood outside while the structure burned down and collapsed on itself. They then left the hut and the woman as is, leaving her body there to be found all these millennia later. Archaeologist Lisa Maher from the University of California says the ritual had something to do with how prehistoric humans viewed the dead. It was likely around 20,000 years ago that early men and women began to look at death as something more than just the demise of the body. They started seeing it as the shedding of the primordial flesh and the continuation of the soul. This primitive ritual was one of the very first death rituals ever conducted by humans. It could have been a way for the tribe to ensure the woman's soul would remain close to the living. Thanks for watching! Which of these ancient rituals do you think was the most extreme? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!